Sarah Running Bear had always been careful about locking her doors. Living alone on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota meant taking extra precautions, especially as a single mother of 2 teenage sons. But lately, her usual caution had turned into something much deeper, a gnawing fear that followed her everywhere she went. It started 3 weeks ago when she found the first note. A crumpled piece of paper had been shoved under her front door during the night. The message was short but clear. "You talk too much. Stop, or face the consequences." Sarah's hands had trembled as she read it, her mind immediately racing to her recent testimony at the tribal council meeting about the missing funds from the youth center project. As the tribe's financial coordinator, Sarah had discovered serious discrepancies in the accounts. Money meant for building a new community center for the children had mysteriously disappeared. When she brought her findings to the tribal council, several prominent members had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She noticed how quickly they wanted to move on to other business, how they avoided her eyes when she presented the evidence. The second note came a week later, this time tucked under her windshield wiper at the grocery store. "Mind your own business, woman. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Sarah looked around the parking lot nervously, wondering who had been watching her, who knew her movements well enough to leave threatening messages. Her sons, Marcus and David, were 16 and 14 years old. They attended the local high school and spent most of their time playing basketball or helping their grandmother with her garden. Sarah had not told them about the notes. She didn't want to worry them, but more importantly, she didn't want them getting involved in something that might put them in danger. The fear began affecting her daily routine. Sarah found herself checking her rearview mirror constantly, while driving, double-checking locks at night and jumping at unexpected sounds. Her work at the tribal office became increasingly stressful as she continued to investigate the missing money despite the obvious pressure to drop the matter. 3 days ago, the third note arrived. This one was different from the others. Instead of being handwritten, it was printed on a computer and left on her desk at work. "Last warning. Drop the investigation or your house might have an accident. Fire spreads quickly on the reservation." The mention of fire made Sarah's blood run cold. Everyone on the reservation remembered the suspicious fires that had plagued the community 5 years earlier, destroying 3 homes and leaving families homeless. Sarah knew she couldn't go to the tribal police. Her investigation had revealed that at least one council member was involved in the missing funds, and she wasn't sure who else might be connected. The reservation's relationship with outside law enforcement was complicated at best, and she worried that bringing in federal agents might make things worse for everyone involved. That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen staring at the latest threat. The house felt too quiet with Marcus at basketball practice and David staying late at school for a science project. She made herself a cup of coffee and tried to think clearly about her options. She could drop the investigation and let the theft go unpunished, but that money was meant for the children of the tribe. It represented hope for a better future, educational opportunities, and safe spaces for young people to gather. On the other hand, continuing her investigation meant putting herself and potentially her sons at risk. The mention of arson in the latest note felt like more than just a threat. It felt like a promise of what would happen if she didn't back down. Sarah walked through her small house, checking the smoke detectors and making sure they had fresh batteries. She looked at the family photos on the walls, pictures of her sons, at various ages, images of her late husband who had died in a car accident 4 years earlier, and photos of extended family members who formed the close-knit community she had always called home. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being threatened by someone within her own community, people who should be protecting her and supporting her efforts to recover stolen money. Instead, she felt isolated and vulnerable, unsure of who she could trust. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah made a decision. She would not be intimidated into silence. The next morning, she would make copies of all her evidence and secure them in different locations. She would also document the threat she had received and find a way to protect herself and her sons while continuing to seek justice. But first, she needed to talk to someone she could trust completely. Her aunt, Emma Crowfeather, was one of the most respected elders on the reservation. Emma had lived through decades of challenges and changes, and her wisdom was sought by many in the community. More importantly, Emma had always been fiercely protective of what was right and just. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed her aunt's number. When Emma answered, Sarah could hear the concern in her voice immediately. "Sarah, child, you sound troubled. What's weighing on your heart?" "Aunt Emma, I need to see you tomorrow morning. There's something important we need to discuss, something that affects the whole community." "Of course, dear, come by early before the sun gets too hot. And Sarah, be careful tonight. The spirits have been restless lately, and I sense change coming." After hanging up the phone, Sarah felt slightly better. Tomorrow she would have someone to talk to, someone who might help her figure out the best way forward. But tonight she would barely sleep, listening to every sound outside her house and wondering if this would be the night someone tried to make good on their threats. She didn't know that by tomorrow evening, everything would change. The fear that had been building inside her for weeks was about to transform into something much more powerful. The realization that she wasn't alone in her fight for justice, and that her community had ways of dealing with threats that went back generations. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when Sarah arrived at her Aunt Emma's house. The small, weathered home sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by prairie grass that swayed gently in the early breeze. Emma was all ready, waiting on her front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands and a knowing look in her eyes. "You're early, even for someone with troubles," Emma said as Sarah approached. "Come, sit with me, and tell me what's been keeping you awake at night." Sarah settled into the old wooden chair beside her aunt and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This porch had always been a place of safety for her, somewhere she could speak freely without fear of judgment or consequences. She pulled the threatening notes from her purse and handed them to Emma. Emma read each note carefully, her weathered face growing more serious with each word. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked out across the prairie for a long moment before speaking. "These are not just threats against you, child. These are threats against our entire community. The money you're trying to recover belongs to all of us, especially our children. Whoever is behind this thinks they can use fear to steal from their own people." Sarah nodded, feeling validated in her decision to continue the investigation despite the risks. "I don't know what to do, Aunt Emma. I can't go to the tribal police because I think someone on the council is involved, and bringing in outside law enforcement." She trailed off, knowing her aunt understood the complications. Emma stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, her hands clasped behind her back. "There are older ways of handling problems like this, Sarah. Ways that were used long before there were police or courts or any of these modern systems. Sometimes the old ways are still the best ways." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're not as alone as you think you are. There are others in our community who know something isn't right. They've been watching, waiting to see if someone would have the courage to speak up. You've shown that courage, and now it's time for the rest of us to show ours." Emma turned back to face her niece, and Sarah was surprised to see a spark of something fierce in her aunt's eyes. "Tell me everything you've discovered about the missing money. Don't leave out any details." For the next hour, Sarah shared everything she had found in her investigation. She explained how the funds for the youth center had been diverted through a series of false invoices and shell companies. She described her suspicions about which tribal council members might be involved, and showed Emma the evidence she had carefully documented. Emma listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting to see specific documents. When Sarah finished her explanation, Emma nodded slowly. "You've done good work, thorough work. But now you need to understand something important. This isn't just about money, and it's not just about one person trying to intimidate you into silence. This is about power and who gets to make decisions. For our people," Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the person or people behind these threats have forgotten something very important about our community. They've forgotten that we take care of our own, and we don't tolerate those who would harm us from within. They've also forgotten that some of us remember the old ways of dealing with such problems." That afternoon, Emma made several phone calls. She spoke in Lakota during most of these conversations, but Sarah caught enough to understand that her aunt was reaching out to other elders, and respected community members. By evening, word had spread through the reservation's informal networks that something important was happening. Sarah went home that evening with instructions from her aunt to continue her normal routine but to be extra careful. Emma assured her that she would not be facing this problem alone much longer, but she also warned that things might get more dangerous before they got better. That night, Sarah tried to follow her aunt's advice about maintaining her routine. She cooked dinner for Marcus and David, helped them with their homework, and watched television with them before sending them to bed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like the heavy pressure in the air before a thunderstorm. Around 10 o'clock, she noticed lights moving slowly past her house. At first, she thought it might be someone driving home late from work, but then she realized the lights weren't following the road. They were moving through the fields around her property, circling her house at a distance. Sarah's heart began to race as she remembered the threat about fire. She quickly went through the house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. She checked on her sons, who were both sleeping peacefully, unaware of their mother's growing panic. The lights continued to move around her property for almost an hour. Sometimes they would stop for several minutes before moving again. Sarah found herself holding her breath during these pauses, wondering if tonight would be the night someone tried to follow through on their threats. Around midnight, her phone rang. Sarah jumped at the sound, her nerves already stretched to their breaking point. When she answered, she heard her Aunt Emma's calm voice. "Sarah, are you all right? Are the boys safe?" "Yes, we're all inside. But Emma, there are lights moving around my house. I think someone is watching us." "I know, child, I've been watching too. Listen to me carefully. Tomorrow evening there will be a gathering. Some of our people want to hear what you have to say about the missing money. They want to see your evidence for themselves." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. Who will be there? People you can trust. People who believe in doing what's right even when it's difficult. People who remember that our community's strength comes from standing together against those who would harm us. "What should I do tonight, about whoever is out there?" Emma was quiet for a moment before answering. "Tonight you stay inside and keep your son safe. Tomorrow everything changes. The person or people who have been threatening you are about to learn that they made a serious mistake when they chose to intimidate one of our own." After hanging up the phone, Sarah continued to watch the lights moving around her property. But, somehow, knowing that her Aunt Emma was aware of the situation made her feel less alone. She also realized that Emma had spoken about the gathering with certainty, as if plans were already in motion that Sarah didn't fully understand yet. The lights finally disappeared around 2 in the morning. Sarah managed to get a few hours of sleep before dawn, but her dreams were filled with images of fire and threats. When she woke up, she had no way of knowing that this would be the last day she would spend in fear, and that by tomorrow, justice would come to her community in a way that would surprise everyone involved. The next day passed slowly for Sarah. She went through the motions of her regular routine, but her mind was focused on the evening gathering that Emma had mentioned. She had no idea what to expect or who would be there, but she spent the afternoon organizing her evidence and preparing to present her findings to whoever wanted to hear them. At work, Sarah noticed that several people seemed to be watching her more carefully than usual. Some offered friendly smiles and words of encouragement, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The division in the community was becoming more apparent, and Sarah realized that word of her investigation had spread further than she had originally thought. Around lunchtime, her supervisor, Janet Crow Dog, stopped by her desk. Janet was a woman in her 50s who had worked for the tribal government for over 20 years. She had always been professional but distant in her interactions with Sarah. "I heard you might be having some problems," Janet said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "If you need to take some time off or if you want to transfer to a different department, I can arrange that." Sarah studied Janet's face, trying to read the intention behind the offer. "Thank you, but I'm fine where I am. I have work to finish here." Janet nodded but didn't look entirely pleased with the response. "Just remember that sometimes the best way to help the community is to avoid causing unnecessary conflict. Not everything that looks wrong actually is wrong. if you understand what I mean. After Janet walked away, Sarah felt even more convinced that her investigation had touched on something significant. The pressure to drop the matter was coming from too many directions to be coincidental. That afternoon, Sarah picked up her sons from school as usual. On the drive home, Marcus mentioned that some of his friends had been asking questions about their family. "Mom, is something going on?" Tommy's dad asked him if you were causing trouble at work, and David's teacher wanted to know if everything was okay at home. Sarah felt a surge of anger that her investigation was affecting her children, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Some people at work aren't happy about a project I'm working on. It's nothing for you and David to worry about." "Are we in danger?" David asked from the back seat. At 14, he was old enough to sense when something was wrong, even if he didn't understand the details. "No, sweetheart, we're not in danger. Our family and our community look out for each other. That's how it's always been, and that's how it always will be." As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah noticed her Aunt Emma's truck parked on the street. Emma was sitting on the front steps of their house, and she stood up as they approached. "Grandmother, Emma," both boys called out, using the respectful term for elders as they ran to greet her. Emma hugged both boys and chatted with them for a few minutes before turning to Sarah. "I came by to walk with you to the gathering tonight. I thought you might want some company." Sarah felt grateful for her aunt's support. "I'd like that very much." After dinner, Sarah arranged for the boys to spend the evening with their cousins, family, telling them she had an important meeting to attend. She changed into her best dress and tried to calm her nerves as she and Emma walked through the quiet streets of the reservation toward the community center. The gathering was being held in the old building behind the community center, a structure that had been used for traditional meetings and ceremonies for decades. As they approached, Sarah could see that the parking area was full of vehicles and warm light spilled out through the windows. Inside, Sarah was surprised to see nearly 50 people seated in a large circle. She recognized most of the faces: elders she had known since childhood, middle-aged parents from her son's schools, and even some younger adults who rarely participated in community meetings. What struck her most was the composition of the group. These were not the wealthy or politically connected members of the tribe. These were working people, families who struggled to make ends meet, elders living on fixed incomes. Emma guided Sarah to 2 empty chairs and then stood to address the group. "We are here tonight because one of our own has discovered something that affects all of us. Sarah Running Bear has been investigating the missing funds from the Youth Center project, and she has found evidence that some of our leaders have been stealing from our children." A murmur went through the group as Emma continued. "Sarah has received threats because of her investigation. Someone wants her to stay quiet and let the theft continue. But we are here to tell her that she is not alone, and we are here to decide what we will do about this situation." Emma sat down, and an elderly man named Robert Ironcloud stood up. Robert was a Vietnam veteran who commanded respect throughout the community. "Sister Sarah, would you please share with us what you have found?" For the next hour, Sarah presented her evidence to the group. She explained the complex scheme that had been used to divert the youth center funds, showed them the false invoices and fraudulent documents, and described how the money had disappeared into accounts controlled by people with connections to the tribal council. As she spoke, Sarah could see anger building in the faces around her. These were people who had donated their own money to the youth center project, who had volunteered their time and labor, who had believed they were building something important for their community's children. When Sarah finished her presentation, the room was quiet for several minutes. Then a woman named Lisa Standing Bear spoke up. "Who is responsible for this? Which council members are involved?" Sarah hesitated. She had her suspicions, but she didn't want to make accusations without absolute proof. "I believe I know who is behind this, but I don't have enough evidence yet to be certain." Robert Ironcloud stood up again. "That's all right, sister. Some of us have been watching and listening for years. We know who has been living beyond their means, who has been making decisions that benefit themselves rather than the community. Your evidence helps confirm what many of us have suspected for a long time." An older woman named Grace Whitehorse raised her hand. "What about the threats against Sarah? What about the danger to her and her family?" Emma stood up to answer this question. That is why we are all here tonight. Sarah has shown courage in bringing this information forward, but courage alone is not enough. She needs our protection and our support. More importantly, our community needs justice. The discussion that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Person after person stood up to share their own experiences with corruption and intimidation within the tribal government. They talked about contracts that went to friends and relatives instead of qualified bidders, about programs that existed on paper but provided no real services, about a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. But what impressed Sarah most was the unity of purpose she saw in the room. These people had come together not just to complain about problems, but to find solutions. They spoke about accountability, about the responsibility they all shared to protect their community's resources and ensure that future generations would have the opportunities they deserved. As the evening progressed, it became clear that this gathering was more than just a meeting. It was the beginning of something much larger, a movement within the community to reclaim their voice and their power from those who had been abusing both for their own benefit. By the time the meeting ended, Sarah no longer felt afraid. She was surrounded by people who believed in her and who were willing to stand with her in the fight for justice. What she didn't know was that some of those same people had already begun taking action to address the threats against her, and that tomorrow would bring changes that none of them could have anticipated. Dawn was just breaking over the Pine Ridge Reservation when the first federal vehicles arrived. Sarah watched from her Aunt Emma's window as unmarked cars and official SUVs made their way through the quiet streets toward predetermined locations throughout the community. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. Joseph Redhawk had left Emma's house at 5 a.m. to coordinate with the federal marshals and FBI agents who had driven in from Rapid City during the night. The operation was carefully planned to ensure that all suspects were arrested simultaneously, preventing anyone from destroying evidence or fleeing the area. Sarah's phone began ringing at 6:30. The first call was from a co-worker who had seen federal agents entering the tribal government offices. The second call was from a neighbor who reported that Janet Crow Dog's house was surrounded by law enforcement vehicles. By 7 o'clock, word was spreading throughout the reservation that something major was happening. Emma made coffee and breakfast while Sarah tried to process the reality that months of fear and investigation were finally coming to an end. Marcus and David were still asleep, unaware that their mother's long ordeal was reaching its conclusion. Around 8 o'clock, Joseph Redhawk called to provide an update. "We've arrested 5 people so far," he told Sarah. 3 tribal council members, your supervisor Janet Crow Dog, and a businessman from Rapid City who was running the shell companies. We're still looking for 2 more suspects, but we have warrants out for their arrest. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and vindication. What happens now? Now we start the process of recovering the stolen money and building the case for trial. Your documentation is going to be crucial in proving exactly how the fraud was carried out and how much money was taken. You should be proud of the work you did, Sarah. Without your courage and persistence, none of this would have been possible. As news of the arrests spread throughout the community, people began gathering at the community center to discuss what had happened and what it meant for their future. Sarah decided to join them, feeling that she owed it to the people who had supported her to be present during this historic moment. When she arrived at the community center, Sarah found a crowd of nearly 200 people. The mood was complex. There was satisfaction that justice was being done, but also sadness that members of their own community had betrayed their trust. Many people were also asking practical questions about what would happen to tribal government operations, while several council members were in custody. Robert Ironcloud stood on the steps of the community center to address the crowd. Today marks the end of one chapter in our community story and the beginning of another. We have learned that we cannot take honest leadership for granted, and we have proven that we will not tolerate those who steal from our children and our future. Grace Whitehorse joined him on the steps. But we also need to remember that this is not just about punishing wrongdoing. This is about building a stronger, more transparent government that truly serves our people. We have work to do to make sure this never happens again. An older man in the crowd raised his hand. What about the money that was stolen? Will we get it back? Joseph Redhawk, who had arrived during the gathering, stepped forward to answer. Federal investigators have already begun the process of freezing accounts and tracing assets. Much of the stolen money appears to still be recoverable, though the legal process will take some time. The important thing is that we now have the evidence needed to pursue full restitution. A woman near the front of the crowd asked, "What about the youth center? Will we still be able to build it?" Sarah found herself stepping forward to answer this question. That depends on all of us. The original funds were stolen, but that doesn't mean the dream has to die. If we're willing to work together, if we're willing to be more involved in how our government operates, we can make sure the youth center gets built. We can make sure our children have the opportunities they deserve. The crowd began to buzz with conversations as people discussed possibilities and made plans. Sarah realized that the arrests were indeed just the beginning of a larger transformation in how the community would govern itself. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned home for the first time in 2 days. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from the rooms. She walked through each room, checking to make sure everything was secure, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. Marcus and David helped her unpack the clothes they had taken to Emma's house. Both boys had heard about the arrests at school and were excited to learn that their mother had played an important role in bringing criminals to justice. "Mom, are you famous now?" David asked, with the earnestness that only a 14-year-old could muster. Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh she had enjoyed in months. "No, sweetheart, I'm not famous. I'm just someone who did what needed to be done." "But everyone at school was talking about how brave you are," Marcus added. "My basketball coach said you're a hero." Sarah sat down with both boys and tried to explain what had really happened. "I'm not a hero. I was just someone who found evidence of wrongdoing and refused to stay quiet about it. But the real heroes are all the people in our community who supported me and helped make sure the truth came out. People like your great-aunt Emma, like Mr. Ironcloud, like all the families who came to the meetings and stood up for what was right." That evening, Sarah received a call from a reporter with the Native American Rights Fund, a legal organization that worked on issues affecting tribal communities throughout the country. The reporter wanted to interview Sarah about her role in uncovering the fraud and about what the case might mean for other tribal communities facing similar problems. Initially, Sarah was reluctant to speak publicly about her experience, but as she thought about it more, she realized that sharing her story might help other people who found themselves in similar situations. "I'll do the interview," she told the reporter, "but I want to make sure the focus isn't just on me. This was a community effort, and it's important that people understand how we all work together to solve this problem." The interview was scheduled for the following week, giving Sarah time to prepare her thoughts about what lessons other communities might learn from their experience. She also wanted to coordinate with the other community leaders to make sure their voices were included in the story. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short months. What had started as a routine financial audit had uncovered a massive fraud, led to death threats against her family, and ultimately resulted in a community-wide movement for greater accountability and transparency. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known before. When faced with intimidation and threats, when pressured to stay quiet and look the other way, she had found the courage to stand up for what was right. She had refused to let fear dictate her actions, and in doing so, she had helped her community reclaim its voice and its power. The phone rang one final time that evening. It was her Aunt Emma calling to check on her and the boys. "How are you feeling tonight, child?" "Different," Sarah replied honestly. Relieved, but also aware that this is really just the beginning. We have a lot of work ahead of us to rebuild, trust in our government, and make sure this doesn't happen again. "That's true," Emma agreed. "But we also have something we didn't have before. We have proof that when our people stand together, we can overcome any challenge. We have proof that justice is possible, Even when it seems like the powerful people hold all the cards. Emma paused for a moment before continuing. You know, Sarah, what you did took more than just courage. It took faith. Faith in your community. Faith in the idea that truth and justice matter more than fear and intimidation. That kind of faith is what our ancestors used to survive and protect our people through much harder times than these. As Sarah hung up the phone and turned off the lights, she realized that Emma was right. Her investigation had started with a simple commitment to protecting money meant for the community's children. But it had grown into something much larger, a reaffirmation of the values and principles that held their community together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities. There would be court proceedings to attend, community, meetings to organize, and the ongoing work of rebuilding their tribal government. But tonight, for the first time in months, Sarah Running Bear could sleep peacefully, knowing that she had helped bring justice to her people and that her community was stronger for having faced this challenge together. The fear that had dominated her life for so long was finally gone, replaced by hope for a future where transparency and accountability would protect their children's opportunities and ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The threats had been real, the danger had been genuine, but in the end, the power of community and the pursuit of justice had proven stronger than intimidation and corruption. The morning after the community gathering, Sarah woke up feeling different. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks had been replaced by something else, a sense of purpose and determination that came from knowing she was no longer facing this challenge alone. She made breakfast for her sons and drove them to school, noticing that several people waved at her more warmly than usual as she passed through the community. At work, however, the atmosphere was tense. Word had apparently spread about the previous evening's meeting, and Sarah could feel the division in the office. Some of her co-workers offered subtle nods of support, while others avoided her completely. Her supervisor, Janet Crow Dog, seemed particularly agitated and kept making phone calls with her office door closed. Around 10 in the morning, Sarah received a call at her desk. The voice on the other end was male and unfamiliar, speaking in a low tone that made her blood run cold. I thought you were smarter than this, Sarah. I thought you understood what would happen if you kept pushing. But you had to go and get others involved, didn't you? Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who's tired of watching you destroy good people's reputations with your lies and accusations. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're nothing but a troublemaker who doesn't understand how things really work around here. The only thing I understand is that money meant for our children has been stolen, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it. The caller laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You think that meeting last night changes anything? You think having a bunch of poor Indians on your side makes you powerful? Let me tell you something, lady. Real power comes from having connections, from knowing which palms to grease and which backs to scratch. You don't have that kind of power. Sarah felt her anger rising. Maybe not, but I have something better. I have the truth. The truth? The caller's voice became even more menacing. The truth is that accidents happen all the time on the reservation. Houses burn down. People get hurt. Sometimes whole families get hurt. It would be a real shame if your boys were walking home from school one day and someone made a mistake while driving. These roads can be so dangerous, especially when visibility is poor. The threat against her sons made Sarah's vision blur with rage. If you touch my children, I will hunt you down myself. You won't have to hunt anyone down if you just mind your own business. Drop this investigation, forget about the money, and go back to being a quiet little bookkeeper. Do that and your family stays safe. Keep causing trouble and we'll see what happens. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone with shaking hands. The caller had crossed a line by threatening Marcus and David directly. Whatever fear she had felt before was nothing compared to the fury that was building inside her now. Sarah immediately called the school to check on her sons, then drove home during her lunch break to make sure the house was secure. As she was checking the locks on her doors, she noticed a pickup truck driving slowly past her house for the third time. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside, but the message was clear. She was being watched. That afternoon, Sarah called her Aunt Emma and told her about the phone threat. Emma's response was swift and decisive. Pack some clothes for yourself and the boys. You're all staying with me tonight and probably for the next few days. And Sarah, it's time for you to know something important about what happened after you left the meeting last night. When Sarah arrived at Emma's house with her sons that evening, she found several vehicles already parked in the driveway. Inside, she discovered that many of the people from the previous night's gathering were there, along with a few faces she didn't recognize. Robert Ironcloud stood up when she entered. Sarah, we need to talk to you about the threats you received today. Word travels fast in our community, and we know about the phone call. Sarah felt surprised that news of the call had already spread, but then she remembered how quickly information moved through the reservation's informal networks. We also need to tell you about some things we've discovered since last night, added Grace Whitehorse. Things that confirm everything you found in your investigation and more. Emma gestured for Sarah to sit down, while Marcus and David went to the kitchen to get something to eat. What we're about to tell you needs to stay in this room for now, but you have a right to know what's been happening. Robert began the explanation. After the meeting last night, several of us decided it was time to do some investigating of our own. We've been watching certain people for months, documenting their activities, keeping track of their associates. What you discovered about the missing youth center funds is just the tip of the iceberg. Grace nodded in agreement. There's been a systematic pattern of theft and fraud going on for at least 3 years. Money from federal programs, tribal gaming, revenues, grant funds for education and health services. It's all been diverted through the same network of fake companies and shell accounts that you identified. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were describing. How much money are we talking about? Over $2 million, Robert said quietly. Money that should have gone to housing, education, healthcare, and community development. Money that could have changed lives and created opportunities for our families. An older man Sarah didn't recognize spoke up from the corner of the room. My name is Joseph Redhawk. I'm a federal investigator with the FBI's Indian Country Crime Unit. I've been working undercover on this case for 6 months, but I haven't been able to gather enough evidence to make arrests. Until now. Sarah stared at him in shock. You're FBI? I'm also Lakota, from the Rosebud Reservation. When we got word that there might be large-scale fraud happening here, they sent me in to investigate. But I needed someone on the inside. Someone with access to the financial records and the courage to document what was happening. You've provided that documentation. Emma reached over and took Sarah's hand. This is why we weren't worried about the threats against you, child. We knew that Joseph was watching, and we knew that the people responsible for the theft were about to face justice. Joseph leaned forward. The phone call you received today was a mistake on their part. We recorded it, and it provides direct evidence of intimidation and obstruction of justice. Combined with your financial evidence and the surveillance we've been conducting, we now have enough to make arrests. Sarah felt like the world was spinning around her. When will this happen? Tomorrow morning, Joseph said. We've coordinated with federal marshals and tribal police officers who aren't involved in the corruption. By this time tomorrow, the people responsible for threatening you and stealing from your community will be in custody. Robert stood up again. But that's not the end of this story, Sarah. The arrests are just the beginning. Our community has learned something important through this process. We've learned that we don't have to accept corruption or intimidation. We've learned that when we stand together, we can protect our own and ensure that justice is done, Grace added. We've also learned that we need to be more involved in how our tribal government operates. We can't just elect people and then trust them to do the right thing. We need to watch them, hold them accountable, and make sure they remember that they work for us, not the other way around. As Sarah listened to the conversations continuing around her, she realized that her decision to investigate the missing funds had started something much larger than she had ever imagined. What began as one woman's determination to recover stolen money had become a community awakening, a movement toward greater transparency and accountability in their tribal government. That night, Sarah slept better than she had in weeks, knowing that her sons were safe and that justice was finally coming to her community. Tomorrow would bring the resolution she had been fighting for, but it would also bring new responsibilities and opportunities that she was only beginning to understand. 6 months later, Sarah Running Bear stood in front of a newly constructed building on the Pine Ridge Reservation, watching as community members put the finishing touches on what would soon become the new youth center. The building was larger and more modern than originally planned, funded not only by the recovered stolen money, but also by additional grants that had been secured through the tribe's new transparent application process. The transformation in the Aya community had been remarkable. The arrests and subsequent trials had made national news, bringing attention to both the problem of tribal government corruption and the power of grassroots community action to address it. More importantly, the experience had catalyzed changes in how the Pine Ridge community governed itself. New tribal council elections had been held, with several of the people who had supported Sarah's investigation winning seats. A new financial oversight committee had been established, with rotating membership to ensure that no small group could control the tribe's resources without community input. Regular public meetings were now held to discuss tribal finances and upcoming projects, and all financial records were made available for community review. Sarah had been offered the position of tribal treasurer, but she had declined, preferring to continue her work as financial coordinator while also serving on the new oversight committee. She wanted to remain close to the day-to-day operations while helping to ensure that the systems were in place to prevent future corruption. The legal proceedings had concluded the previous month. All 5 of the original arrestees had been convicted on federal charges including fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Janet Crow Dog had received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, while the 3 tribal council members had each been sentenced to between 5 and 10 years. The businessman from Rapid City who had operated the shell companies received the longest sentence, 12 years, due to his role as the ringleader of the operation. More than $1.8 million of the stolen money had been recovered through asset forfeiture and restitution orders. The remaining funds had been spent or hidden in ways that made recovery impossible, but the amount that was returned was enough to complete the youth center project and fund several other community initiatives that had been postponed due to lack of resources. The youth center was scheduled to open in 2 weeks, with a grand celebration plan that would include traditional ceremonies, community meals, and demonstrations of the programs that would be offered to local children and teenagers. The building included a gymnasium, computer lab, art studios, and spaces for cultural activities and language classes. Sarah's sons, Marcus and David, had been among the first to sign up for programs at the new center. Marcus was excited about the expanded basketball facilities, while David was interested in the new science and technology programs that would be offered. Both boys had grown considerably during the month since the investigation began, not just physically, but in their understanding of civic responsibility and community involvement. The story of the Pine Ridge investigation had indeed attracted national attention, just as the reporter from the Native American Rights Fund had predicted. Sarah had given interviews to several news organizations and had spoken at conferences about tribal governance and community organizing. The case had become a model for other tribal communities facing similar challenges with corruption and lack of transparency. But perhaps more meaningful to Sarah were the smaller, everyday changes she observed in her community. People were more engaged in local government, attending meetings and asking questions about how decisions were made. Younger community members were getting involved in civic activities, inspired by the example of what could be accomplished when people work together for common goals. The fear that had dominated Sarah's life during the investigation had been replaced by a sense of accomplishment and ongoing purpose. She no longer worried about threats or intimidation, but she remained vigilant about protecting the systems and processes that had been put in place to ensure accountability and transparency. Emma Crow Feather, now in her 70s, had become something of a celebrity herself, frequently invited to speak at gatherings throughout Indian country about the importance of elder wisdom in community organizing. She often joked that she had learned more about organizing from Sarah than Sarah had learned from her, but everyone who knew Emma understood that her guidance and support had been crucial to the success of the entire effort. Robert Ironcloud, had been elected to the tribal council in the special elections that followed the arrests, and he had become a strong advocate for continued reforms in tribal government operations. Grace Whitehorse had been appointed to chair the new Financial Oversight Committee, a role that suited her attention to detail and her commitment to protecting community resources. Joseph Redhawk had completed his undercover assignment and returned to his regular duties with the FBI, but he maintained contact with the Pine Ridge community and had become an advocate within federal law enforcement for supporting tribal communities in addressing corruption and building stronger governance systems. On this particular day, as Sarah watched the final preparations for the youth center opening, she received a call from a woman on the Crow Reservation in Montana. The woman had read about the Pine Ridge investigation and wanted advice about addressing similar problems in her own community. "I found evidence that someone has been stealing from our housing program," the woman explained. "But I'm scared to come forward. I've heard about what happened to you, about the threats you received. I don't know if I'm brave enough to go through something like that." Sarah found herself repeating advice that Emma had given her months earlier. "You're not as alone as you think you are. Start by finding one person you trust completely, someone who shares your commitment to doing what's right. Talk to that person about what you found. Then find another person, and another. Build a network of support before you take any public action. What if the people threatening me try to hurt my family? Document everything. Keep records of any threats you receive. And remember that people who steal from their own community are usually cowards at heart. They rely on fear and intimidation because they know they can't win if the truth comes out. Your job is to make sure the truth does come out, and to make sure you have support when it does." After ending the call, Sarah realized that her experience at Pine Ridge had given her a new role, helping other communities learn from their success and avoid the mistakes that had allowed corruption to flourish for so long. It was a responsibility she was willing to accept, knowing that the lessons learned in her community could help protect children and families throughout Indian country. That evening, Sarah attended a community meeting at the new youth center to discuss programming and policies for the facility. As she looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors and friends, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction about what they had accomplished together. The building they were sitting in represented more than just recovered stolen money or successful law enforcement. It represented the power of ordinary people to stand up for their values and create positive change in their community. It represented the idea that justice was possible, even in situations where it seemed like the powerful held all the advantages. Most importantly, it represented hope for the future, hope that the children who would use this facility would grow up in a community where transparency and accountability were normal, where citizen involvement in government was expected, and where anyone who tried to steal from the community would face swift and certain consequences. As Sarah drove home that night, she passed the house where she had lived in fear just months earlier. The same streets that had once seemed threatening now felt like home again, protected by a community that had learned to protect itself. The woman who had once been terrified of anonymous threats had become a leader and advocate, someone other communities looked to for guidance and inspiration. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Sarah Running Bear had helped her community discover its own power, and now that power would be used to build a better future for generations to come. The fear was gone, replaced by determination and hope. Justice had been served, but more than that, justice had become a living principle that would guide the community's decisions for years to come.